Thank you for joining us on another edition of Against the Current. On this installment, our guest is Bethany McLean. She is the author of the new book, Shaky Ground, talking about the GSEs in the housing market, Fannie and Freddie, and what happened that led up to the bubble bursting, and where Fannie and Freddie stand today. Coming to you, as we always do, atop the Skyline Club, or atop the Old Republic building at the well-appointed Skyline Club. Bethany, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Should mention Bethany, a CNBC contributor, Vanity Fair contributing editor, Fortune columnist, and also the author, probably a lot of you know her name from this, The Smartest Guys in the Room, documenting the Enron scandal, which was turned into an award-winning documentary.
True.
And so I wanted to mention The Smartest Guys in the Room, not only for placing you in the minds of so many, but also because in the book about Fannie and Freddie and what happened during the housing crisis, one of the regulators of Fannie and Freddie characterized Fannie and Freddie as a government-sponsored Enron. What did he mean by that?
Well, he was trying to make the case that Fannie Mae was as out of control as Enron was. What I think is more telling is the backstory, which is, can you imagine in what other country, what other industry, what other company would have its very own regulator compare it to Enron? And especially when the proof actually wasn't there that the company was committing financial malfeasance along the lines of Enron. So what it more is...
Wasn't there the accusation, though, of like a $9 billion accounting scandal?
Yeah, which turns out to be a little bit suspect. When all the dust settled. But Fannie's regulator, along with some others in the government, were trying to destroy the company. And so they were creating this, all these allegations of wrongdoing and using phrases like a government-sponsored Enron. And what I think is so interesting about that is that it shows the well-deserved hatred that existed toward these institutions, Fannie and Freddie, in part because at that time they were so politically powerful. And people felt like there was no way to rein them in unless you really had this sort of orchestrated campaign to do them in.
And so there's two schools of thought about what happened, why the housing bubble burst. At least two, but there's two kind of that seem a lot.
Many different versions of the truth as you want. Well,
sure, but there seems to be a lot of people that kind of attach themselves to one of these two schools. Right. The one school is school that Ed Pinto and some scholars like at the American Enterprise Institute suggest that this was mainly the result of banks responding to a government engendered moral hazard to lend money to low-income, high-risk borrowers who couldn't pay back the loans, who shouldn't have been in the home ownership, in the space of home ownership, and that was the cause of the bubble, or the preponderant cause. And there's the second school of thought that actually it was people that were doing stated income loans, the Alt-A loans, as they're termed in the book, no income verification, people that were otherwise creditworthy, and doing cash-out refinances and buying investment properties with easy access to credit. Which, if either of those schools, is where the truth lies?
Well, I think there's some truth to both, right? And so my problem with your first theory is that people who voice it are usually absolutist about it. They say this was the problem. It was the government presence in the housing market and the government forcing institutions to make risky loans. And they have numbers saying that I think 17 million risky mortgages were on the books of Fannie and Freddie in the spring of 2008. So it was these two institutions' fault and the push to have them make riskier loans to people under a 1992 act that mandated that they make a certain amount of risky mortgages to people.
A lot of people, though, just to not to interrupt, but a lot of people wind it back to the Community Reinvestment Act of the late 70s. The Community Reinvestment Act becomes a little part of that story too. I think that's part of the problem. The government emphasis on what I've called the cult of home ownership was definitely part of the problem. Fannie and Freddie were definitely part of the problem. They were not by any means the whole problem. And all you have to do to see that is to look at the sheer amount of money that people were making in the run-up to the mortgage boom. We had former pizza boys who were becoming multimillionaires selling mortgages. This wasn't people running around doing something to satisfy the government. This was people going where the money was, which happened to be made in this kind of mortgage. But it's become this religious war, right? Because if you can say the government caused the problem, then you can say, oh, well, we don't need any more. We don't need any different regulation for our financial system. We don't need anything at all. All we need to do is get rid of the government, and we'll all be just fine. I think the
data is pretty convincing when you look at some recent studies that have come out that show that actually most of the defaults were from wealthier borrowers who were using their loans to do cash out refinancings, take out a bigger mortgage and spend the difference in cash, buy investment homes. There are actually numbers that less than 10% of risky mortgages went to first-time home buyers. So if you had limited risky mortgages to first-time home buyers, we never would have had a crisis. This was all of us. We were all in it together. The causes are multifactorial, and that makes it very unsatisfying because people always want to find the villain, right?
Well, this is like the at least the trailer for The Big Short, which is coming out. This movie coming out on topic, and I think it's the Steve Carell character is at a strip joint, and he says something about the housing market, and the stripper says, "Wait, what did you say? I've got 5 homes," right? So to your point about people just using easy access to credit, where they just make a statement, they don't have to provide the collateralization or the proof of their income, and they're buying up homes, and then the market flips.
Right. My favorite number, going back to this point about 16 or 17 million risky mortgages being on the books of Fannie and Freddie in the spring of 2008, the peak delinquency rate, not default rate, but delinquency rate on Fannie and Freddie backed mortgages was 1.5 million. So it sounds really big and scary that they had 16 or 17 million risky loans on their books in the spring of 2008, but risk in financial markets is likelihood of default, right? And if the delinquency rate was that small, then you have to ask, is something wrong with the definition of risk that was used to characterize all of these loans as risky? Well, maybe.
Well, is there something fundamentally flawed with these GSEs, these government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie and Freddie?
There's a lot that's fundamentally flawed.
Well, but let's start.
That's part of the problem.
Yeah, let's start. I guess, So let's start with one of the fundamentals potentially, which is this idea of serving 2 masters.
Right.
They're government-sponsored enterprises that are in business to make money.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they also have to meet these kind of social goals like affordable housing levels.
Right.
Are those things kind of hopelessly conflicted?
You know what? I've actually started thinking about this. That has been accepted as a given for so long about these 2 companies. It's so hopelessly conflicted. You can't possibly serve 2 masters. There's actually been a movement in the business world away from this sort of monomaniacal focus on shareholder value to talk about stakeholder value, to say we all have more people we should be pleasing than just the bottom line and shareholders, whether it's making sure customers get a good product, whether it's making sure we take care of our communities. And so I started thinking about this, and then I read some histories of banking. And banks have charters, and the granting of the charter to a bank used to come with the acceptance of some obligation to the social good by the bank. And so I started to think, well, is it so horribly conflicted that these 2 companies serve 2 masters, or is that actually the way our system works at its best? In other words, each keeps the other in check. The need to make profits keeps the companies from going crazy and making mortgages to people who can't pay them back. And this focus on this larger mission keeps them from just being about their own bottom lines. I recognize this is completely contrarian, but I was thinking about that, and I'm not so sure I'm not so sure I buy that's the biggest problem. I think the bigger problem is this economic problem of this implicit guarantee, right? So there was always this idea with Fannie and Freddie that the government would stand behind them and bail them out if push came to shove.
So this creates the moral hazard.
But it wasn't explicit, and they didn't pay for it. And when you asked anybody about it, they would say, no, no, no. But yet everybody knew the implicit guarantee was there. And so if you think about it, how screwed up is that, right? To have an implicit guarantee, what on earth is that even? And so that, to me, is the heart of the problem. And the heart of the problem with anything going forward is what do you do?
Well, these agencies were sold coming out of the Great Depression on the idea that home ownership creates more stable communities, a more responsible, civic-minded American. So they came out of the Depression. They almost pushed us into another depression, according to many. But I guess the underlying premise, the marketing of this to the American people back after the Great Depression, is there any evidence to back that up, that homeowners are more civic-minded and responsible than renters?
I don't think there is. That's why I've called it the cult of homeownership. That said, this notion of homeownership goes way back in the American psyche. I actually was surprised because in the view of the crisis that Fannie and Freddie caused it was all the fault of the government. The common thing is this program that Bill Clinton started when he became president called Americans for Homeownership. I'm blanking on the exact name, but Bill Clinton started a major homeownership push, Partners in Homeownership, I think it was. And so you think, oh, that's when it started, when Bill Clinton became president. Actually, it dates back to the 1800s. It's as old as our country is. This idea that a country of landowners would make a better society. And it's not just politicians caring about our welfare that we own homes and the shape of our society. It's also economic. Mariner Eccles, who was Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, I think, called housing the wheel within the wheel of our economic engine. And now housing-related activities are 15 to 20% of GDP. So essentially, if you don't have a strong housing market, you don't have a strong economy. And that's why I feel like everybody should care about this issue. You know, this is critical, whether you own a mortgage, whether you have a mortgage, whether you expect to ever have a mortgage, whether you own a house, or whether you just are involved in the economy, as we all are. How we finance housing is really critical to all of our well-being.
Well, I want to go back to that. So the idea of home ownership, owning your plot, laying down roots, may be embedded in the American psyche, but Fannie and Freddie aren't.
Right.
And even just in the last 30 or 40 years, the amount of mortgages that are sourced at Fannie and Freddie has jumped considerably.
Right.
So can we have this notion, this romantic notion, an important economic notion, as you suggest, of home ownership without Fannie and Freddie being so instrumental in it?
Well, you can't without some sort of government guarantee. And I'm going to say can't in a blanket sort of way, which I'm not sure is fair, because look, we've never had a mortgage market without Fannie, which was created in the wake of the Great Depression. So we don't actually know what the mortgage market would look like if you got the government out of it. But most people accept that you couldn't have a 30-year fixed rate, fully prepayable mortgage, which we as Americans have come to accept as our birthright. And without that, home prices would probably fall. Some estimates are pretty dramatically. And mortgage credit would be a lot harder to come by for people of middle to lower income living in less desirable areas of the country, and there certainly wouldn't be a constant supply of mortgage credit. It would be when the banks felt like lending and the economy was good, would have a mortgage market, and when they didn't and they were scared, like in the wake of the credit crisis in 2008, there would be no mortgage market. So without, and that's simply because there's a lot of money sloshing around out there. There are a ton of investors, right? And so everybody always says, oh, somebody would invest in American mortgages. Not for 30 years. Nobody wants to take American homeowner credit risk for 30 years, because big investors aren't capable of doing the analysis of you, me, and 100,000 other people to make sure we're all really capable of paying our mortgage and they want to invest in this. So the government Fannie and Freddie stamping their guarantee on this makes these securities something that lots of people want to invest in.
But isn't something that you suggest might happen without the government backing? Isn't that happening now? I mean, are we repeating some of the same mistakes? It seems like it's, from everything I read, it's much easier to get a 3.5% FHA loan than it is that fixed 30-year mortgage if you have good credit.
Well, it depends on who you are.
I mean, Steve Moore, the chief economist at the Heritage Foundation, wrote a piece a couple of months ago that got a lot of attention because he's a pretty good credit risk.
Right.
He's had a number of homes, and he couldn't get a mortgage from his bank.
And Ben Bernanke,
that's right.
Ben Bernanke did too. But that's part of the problem, right? Right now we have these two institutions called Fannie and Freddie. They are essentially owned by the U.S. government, propped up by a line of credit from Treasury. They have no capital, so they can't really fulfill their function, which is to support the mortgage market. All of their profits are being drained to the U.S. Treasury and spent on balancing the budget. And so people like Steve Moore and Ben Bernanke can't get mortgages because mortgage credit remains so tight 7 years out from the crisis. And everybody keeps saying, oh, well, it's going to normalize. The financial crisis is becoming something that kids graduating from high school don't remember. You know what I mean? And mortgage credit still hasn't normalized. And that's because the administration has done nothing to figure out our housing market.
Is that why you call the Fannie and Freddie zombie agencies?
Yeah. So
they're in this limbo state 7 years into conservatorship where nobody wants to do anything because nobody knows exactly what to do, and because those institutions are so precarious yet so important in the international financial system with, for example, the investments that China and Japan have made. In mortgage-backed securities, and so this is a kind of a problem of policy paralysis.
It totally is. That's a great way to sum it up. And to put a slightly different spin on it, Fannie and Freddie together are collectively the largest financial institution in the world. They have over $5 trillion of outstanding liabilities, a good chunk of which is owned by banks in China and Japan. And so we can't move to do anything to pull the rug out from under those securities without it possibly impacting the price of treasuries and our ability to sell the debt that funds the country. So it is this policy paralysis. And then there's also this sort of widespread acceptance, even on the part of some Republicans, that you need to maintain a government guarantee some form of government guarantee backstopping the mortgage market in order to keep the supply of mortgage credit flowing well. But no Republican wants to actually sign off on that. And so nobody wants to do anything because nobody wants to own what might have to be done. And now, it's all so unpalatable.
And you just mentioned something that I want to explore a little bit because I think it's important. The federal government essentially shifting the profits Fannie and Freddie are generating currently to pay down budget deficits or whatever else they want to use that money for. And so it puts them in this precarious position, but it also has engendered substantial litigation that could end up costing taxpayers hundreds of millions, billions of dollars yet again. Explain.
So there was actually a great document in a lawsuit today that I'll come back to. But so when the U.S. government took over Fannie and Freddie in 2008, the darkest days of the financial crisis, they put them into this state called conservatorship, in which Fannie and Freddie were propped up by this line of credit from the U.S. government. But the government didn't nationalize them. They left 20% of Fannie and Freddie's securities trading. And one of the main reasons for that was we don't want to put the debt on the balance sheet. I mean, the number of financial games that have been played over history with these two companies is just astonishing. So they left this stock outstanding, and the company's regulator even said at the time, you know what, this might be worth something someday. So fast forward to summer 2012, it started to look like Fannie and Freddie were going to start making a lot of money. And so the government changed the rules, and they said, instead of just having Fannie and Freddie pay us a dividend on the money they've taken from taxpayers, we're going to take every penny they ever make from now into the future. And the government's ostensible reason for doing this was these two companies are never going to be profitable. They can't pay the dividend. We need to put in place a structure that can stretch out into the future that isn't unworkable for them. But a bunch of the investors in the company's securities said, oh, no, it was obvious these two companies were going to become public. And this document in a lawsuit today just shows what the lawyers refer to as windfall profits that the government thought Fannie and Freddie were going to make. So there's always been all this sort of dark speculation. Well, didn't the government just want to get its hands on the hundreds of millions of dollars of profit that was going to come from these two companies? And so all the investors, some of the biggest hedge funds in the country, are suing the U.S. government over this situation. And it's unclear what the course of the legal cases is going to be and what the remedy would be if they win. But it's really scary, right? Because you could have a huge victory in one of these lawsuits where suddenly a court says, oh, U.S. government, you owe hedge funds $100 billion. I mean, I'm exaggerating. Right. I don't think it could be that bad, but it's frightening.
But you essentially have another bailout, taxpayer-funded bailout. Right. That's essentially what would be necessitated.
You just have this uncertainty about the structure of our housing market that is lingering out there, while the government just won't make any decisions about what to do with these two companies.
So we're talking about this, macro problems, but people live micro lives.
Right.
And so how does all of this uncertainty in the structure, in the future form of Fannie and Freddie, how does that root down to the individual homeowner or prospective homeowner?
Right. Well, I think it matters to everybody because if you're going to get a mortgage at any point in your life, you care about the structure of the mortgage market because that dictates your ability to get that mortgage and at what cost you're going to be able to get it. If you own a home, you care because how we finance housing determines the price of housing. And there's, I think, a pretty good academic analysis that if you yanked Fannie and Freddie government support out of the housing market, home prices could fall quite a bit. So what still is most Americans' major asset, our homes, could plunge in value depending on the decisions that are made in Washington about how to finance home ownership going forward. And then because this is so important to the economy, you care. It is home prices that set off our last big, great recession, right? And so you care about this. And when you look at these two companies throughout history, there's this one thing that stands out, which is that we, the citizens, have never cared about these two companies. We don't want, it feels complicated, we don't want to get involved. So we let the decisions be made in Washington by special interest groups, and we just sort of live with the consequences of their decisions. And so part of the reason I wrote the book was just care, you know? It doesn't matter, you can agree or disagree that we should get rid of these companies. You can, but have an opinion and get involved in caring so that it doesn't look like the government can just do things that have these big impacts on all of us, and we don't even understand what's happening.
And your book, Shaky Ground, is like a good primer to kind of to just paint the landscape, understand what some of the challenges, what a little bit of the history is, what some of the challenges are, what we need to think about, and encourage people to explore further, which is useful. And the other takeaway from your book is that the political alliances, because ultimately this is a political problem, this is a policy problem.
Yep.
The political or policy alliances are very strange, as they can be in Washington, where you have conservative free market types like Ed Pinto at American Enterprise Institute, aligned with former Massachusetts Congressman Barney Frank.
Right.
And hedge funds are trying to salvage big government. You know, I mean, it's a little bit like you need a bit of a scorecard to understand why the interests are aligned the way they are and what they're really trying to achieve.
Right.
So if there are these zombie agencies that are in limbo 7 years after conservatorship, what are some of the policy options that at least should be debated and considered, kind of the range?
Right. Well, so one policy option is get rid of these companies, right? Get the government out of the mortgage market.
Right. And you see, even though you're a free market type, you suggest that's not feasible.
I don't think it's feasible for two reasons. I don't think it's feasible at a time when income inequality is everybody's major talking point, and when people are scared about their economic prospects and their children's economic prospects, to say, you know what, everybody on their own. If the cost of your mortgage, you middle income person in Kansas, is twice the price of the mortgage of the wealthy person in New Jersey, you know what, that's life. I don't know if that's ever going to be doable, but it sure isn't doable right now. I don't think there's a single politician that's going to sign off on that. So maybe it was the right way to structure the mortgage market all along, but after 80 years of having a government presence that evened out the cost of mortgages across the country, very hard to go there from where we are.
It's always easier to say the problem with the regulations we had, they weren't big enough. The programs weren't big enough, so we need more regulation a la Dodd-Frank of the banks.
Right. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that either.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just saying the argument that's made. I'm not saying Dodd-Frank is good regulation. I'm just saying it's so much easier to say we're going to come in and provide that oversight that was lacking before, and it was a lack of oversight, not a problem of undue regulation.
Right, and it was both. The problem with regulation is that it pushes people all to do things at the same time because there are loopholes, and that opens the loopholes. But anyway, the second part of the problem is when most people talk about privatizing the mortgage market, they talk about having the big banks have a much bigger share of the mortgage market than they do now. Not only owning the front end, the making mortgages to consumers, but also the back end. And in some of the bills that have been proposed in Congress, the big banks would have a government guarantee on the mortgage-backed securities that they sold.
So we're in kind of the same place.
Well, we are in the same place. That's the thing. The big banks were government-sponsored enterprises in the financial crisis too. They too had to be bailed out. It's debatable whether Dodd-Frank fixed that. I don't happen to think it did, but let's just give it to the people who say Dodd-Frank fixed it and say, okay, Dodd-Frank fixed it. If the big banks control the nation's mortgage market, they won't be allowed to fail in the next crisis either. They can't, because you need to keep the flat flow of mortgage credit going. So then we've just undid everything we tried to do to fix the problem of too big to fail banks. I don't think there is such a thing as a private mortgage market, and to me that's the elephant in the room. Until you tell me of a mortgage market that can be financed without the big banks having more involvement in it, if you get rid of Fannie and Freddie, I don't think there is such a thing. It's just making monsters out of the big banks. Well,
you couldn't do it if you are. I mean, this to me again is where you're trying to serve 2 or 3 or 4 masters. You couldn't do that and then say, I'm also going to concern myself with income inequality.
Right.
You have to say that these are the rules of the game and everybody has to abide their responsibilities and there's no safety net.
But even then, I still think we would bail out the big banks if they were the backbone of the mortgage market. Even in a world, I still think we would have to bail them out. So to me, I've come to believe that it's a line I like to use, that Fannie and Freddie are like Winston Churchill's famous saying about democracy: the worst possible thing with a possible exception of everything else. I think we know what the problems with Fannie and Freddie are. I think there are ways to regulate them in a smarter way, to cap their returns like a utility, so that they're not chasing profits in the way they were that led into the financial crisis. And I think that's a better solution than a lot of other things that are being tossed around out there. But A, that's really controversial, and B, it's almost not feasible because there's so much hatred toward these two companies, particularly in Washington, where in their heyday they were powerful bullies. And so a lot of people feel like, I got kicked around by Fannie and Freddie, now they're down, I'm going to kick them back. I mean, these things are very personal. You expect them to be sort of abstract policy debates, but they're not. They're very personal too.
But there's one of the other problems though too, going back to this idea that you can have them pursue profit at the same time as abiding certain social goals like affordable housing metrics. But I mean, that still calls for some kind of central planning, a board of mystics that knows exactly what these goals should be, that has everything properly calibrated, and we've lost faith in a lot of boards of mystics in government, at big banks, and elsewhere.
That we have. The problem is these boards of mystics, as you put it, underpin a lot more of our economy than just Fannie and Freddie. I guess maybe where we end up on the same page is that I could see a financial system that made a whole lot more sense than the one we have, but it would have to be whole-scale revision to our financial system. It couldn't just be wiping out Fannie and Freddie and leaving the structure of the big banks the way they are and the structure of the Federal Reserve the way it is. That, to me, is getting like chopping off a tiny piece of the problem and saying you've solved it, when in reality, by lopping off a little part of the beast, you've just actually made the whole thing that remains a lot worse.
So, I mean, if what you're suggesting, this is Fannie and Freddie's existence is the worst except for everything else, every other option, then how do we get out of this limbo state that you describe in your book and to some kind of reform that empowers Fannie and Freddie to do the things that it needs to do to serve both masters? Right.
Well, you have to let them capitalize, have money again. I don't know if you followed this, it's kind of fascinating. So there's been this whole congressional brouhaha over the FHA only having 2% capital, and how horrible this is. I mean, the FHA is 100% nationalized, right? But there's still been this brouhaha. It only has 2% capital. Fannie and Freddie, multiple times the size, no capital. And so the idea that we're letting these two institutions function with no capital is insane, and people justify it by saying, well, they're effectively nationalized. Well, then why doesn't that argument apply to FHA too? You can't have it both ways.
So you're suggesting that the federal government needs to stop the skim?
They need to stop the skim. I mean, it's insane. The idea that you can have these two companies that are collectively the largest financial institution in the world that still have shareholders, thanks to the federal government's decision, by the way. The federal government could have wiped out shareholders in 2008 and we wouldn't be here now. They made the decision to keep shareholders in place. And then they're taking all the money and spending it on whatever they feel like spending it on. I think it's completely insane.
That sounds kind of like an amicus brief for the hedge funds that are suing the federal government.
It does. The place where I disagree with the hedge funds is that I'm not sure what's left for them. If you do allow Fannie and Freddie to recapitalize and you put in place a smart structure that makes sense, I don't really know what's left for investors. I don't know that they get a huge payoff at the end of the day. I don't think these two companies go back to being, I think Fannie was the third most profitable company per employee in the world in the late 90s, and Freddie was close behind. I mean, these two companies were hugely powerful, profitable enterprises.
And a lot of people remember the golden parachutes that Franklin Raines, Jim Johnson got.
Their executives made an enormous amount of money. If you don't want to go back to those days, you want to structure them in a way that makes a lot more sense, perhaps with these utility-like caps on their returns, and then that means I'm not sure what's left for investors.
Well, right, so, and I mean, you'll have the same crocodile tears for the big banks, for the hedge funds too. They have a limited constituency, however powerful.
I think they have.
They are.
I actually think they have a much more limited constituency than the big banks do. For some reason,
talk about trending to zero. That is a competition. It's a race to the bottom. The two of them.
But I think somehow the big banks manage to be a little more amorphous somehow, so people don't realize that some of the things they're for are actually in the interest of the big banks, whereas hedge funds, it's just this.
Yeah, they're less understandable maybe, but
maybe so.
But I mean, when TBTF becomes an acronym that everyone knows,
you're right.
Then
you're
the
right.
big banks are in a bad PR place.
We could have a contest on whether the big banks or the hedge funds are more hated. It would be interesting. But that is back to your earlier point. That is one of the funniest things about this, is that the hedge funds are actually allied with consumer groups and saying we need to bring Fannie and Freddie back. I mean, that has to be one of the world's most unlikely alliances, right?
That's what politics is, aligning interests.
Right.
And those interests could be very fleeting, but they're there for the moment.
But that one is actually, the notion that it's fleeting is really interesting, because you could see if politicians did say, okay, let's let Fannie and Freddie recapitalize and start to have some stability, you could see then the hedge fund community group alliance becoming very fraught, because the community groups would want the money to go toward affordable housing and the hedge funds would want it to go for shareholders. So, I mean, at some point that's an alliance that could fracture. But,
well, the other thing though too is you have a lot of suburban communities. We see that here in Chicago, where you have kind of a political push for affordable housing, and particularly in more well-heeled areas like the North Shore, for example, they like the idea of affordable housing in theory,
but not in my
but they
backyard.
don't like it in Wilmette, right? They like windmills, but they don't want windmills on their lakefront property.
NIMBY, right?
Right.
Classic term.
So that is also kind of an interesting dynamic of people who support things in theory, except when it's visited upon them in reality.
It is. But the flip side of supporting things in theory is that I talk to a lot of people who say, well, just get the government out of the housing market. It's a little bit like hands off my Medicare, right? Get the government out of the housing market. I don't want any government in the housing market. Well, look, the homeownership rate is back down to a 43 or a 48-year low. It's plummeted since the financial crisis. And a lot of people would say that's good. Homeownership was too high. We had too many people owning homes, so it's better that it's plummeted. So, but people have to sleep somewhere at night, right? Unless you want sort of like an Uber of sleeping at night, where you go online and you bid for a bed at night.
Airbnb.
I mean, I don't think we're quite there yet. Airbnb every night. I don't think we're quite there yet. So people need somewhere to sleep. So the rental ranks are growing wildly, and there's a lack of affordable rentals too. And so, and there are actually numbers that the average renter spends about double on expenses what a homeowner does. So the number of rent-challenged people where their income is, where their rent costs, their housing costs chew up like 50% of their income, is growing really dramatically too. So you can say, and friends of mine who are on the free market at all costs side say, well, that's okay. I mean, have people out on the streets because there's no place they can sleep. That's the way the world should be. I mean, again, not in my backyard. I don't want to live in a society like that. So I think we have some really challenging dynamics in this country.
So if we're going to do and make the case for the Fannie and Freddie, but in some kind of evolved way 7 years after the burst and the conservatorship, one of the cases you're going to have to make, well, there's this new regulatory scheme that's going to prevent what happened last time from happening again. Right. And one of the problems you have, and this is endemic to government, is an agency capture problem, where the agencies that regulate these entities end up becoming facilitators to whatever the agencies, whatever these entities want to do, regardless of what the law says or what the regulatory oversight is supposed to provide. And so how to avoid the agency capture.
I totally agree with that. And it's worse than agency capture, because you would have politician capture too. And so even if you started out, say you said, okay, this implicit guarantee that Fannie and Freddie long had, we're going to have to make it explicit. They're going to pay a fee. That's a fee that reflects the real cost of the credit they're getting from taxpayers, and they're going to pay a fee to taxpayers every year, and we're going to price this appropriately. You can see over the years, the crisis gets further behind. Politicians say, ooh, but if we lessen the fee they pay, they'll have more money and they can make loans to more people and we can help expand home ownership. I mean, it's almost inevitable, and that's why there's this notion in economic circles that if you have a subsidy, any kind of subsidy, even if it starts out fairly priced, if it's something like homeownership that is this political thing, it just inherently is going to be corrupted. And you can start out with structuring these two companies as well as you might want to, with the best of intentions and the best of regulations and a guarantee that's paid for, but it's going to inevitably go bad, even if it's 50 years from now. And you know what? I don't disagree with that. So
then we just have to get used to bubbles being blown up and bursting every generation or so?
I mean, on the flip side, right, when you look at the Great Depression, we didn't have a Fannie and Freddie then. That was the private market financing homes. 25% of mortgages went into default in the Great Depression. So the idea that the private market does this better, and they always make safe, rational loans so that there's never defaults and so that only people who can afford mortgages get them, well, no. History would tell you that's not true either.
But the damage tends to be more localized when it's private market actors versus...
the damage wasn't localized in the Great Depression.
Well, you could argue, as Milton Friedman did, that it was deepened by government policies.
You could. But then you also have to look at the financial crisis, too, and coming back to this notion, well, was it all Fannie and Freddie? The default rates on comparable private sector mortgages, those that didn't go through Fannie and Freddie but were sold by Wall Street instead, is 4 times higher than the default rates on Fannie and Freddie backed loans. So
but your free market friends would say, okay, well, if the public sector guys were better at managing risk in this finite period of time, well, then good for them, and the private sector guys have to suffer the consequences in the market. But then at least you have risk and reward, where in this kind of amorphous government-sponsored enterprise world, you have risk and reward, but no real risk.
Right. No, I hear you, but I think arguing that somehow we would have a rational mortgage market where we didn't have bubbles is, if we only had the private market, is just not true history-wise. We would absolutely have bubbles and crashes. And in a world like the one we live in, my argument is the government would bail out the private sector actors too. And it's really interesting when you go back to 2008, what even the foes of Fannie and Freddie said, Hank Paulson, Larry Summers, people who hated these two institutions said, we have to keep them going. We have to keep the supply of credit to the mortgage market, or the economy is completely going to collapse. If people can't get mortgages and can't move and can't, then our economy completely goes under.
Paulson, the Secretary of Treasury at the time, basically said that was the most important decision he made.
Yeah, he made, right. That's a really good point. That's exactly right. And so so the idea that anybody, say 30 years from now, if you have a big bank supporting the mortgage market, the Hank Paulson of his time is going to say, forget Dodd-Frank, we've got to keep this big bank going because we can't interrupt the supply of mortgage credit. That's true in Europe. People say, well, Europe doesn't have a Fannie and Freddie. Their banks finance the housing market. They do it without the government involvement. Well, no, actually they don't. Europe had to bail out their banks in the financial crisis too, because they couldn't let them fail.
Europeans don't do anything without their government.
Right. I know. Well, it's sort of ironic that people would say, well, Europe doesn't have them.
Yeah, right.
But they absolutely do. They have national banks that are so I just think the whole notion of a private sector, of large companies that control the mortgage market ever being truly private market participants is just totally flawed.
And so if you're advising policymakers on Capitol Hill,
right,
give me like the next 2 or 3 steps they should take to bring Fannie and Freddie out of their limbo and into kind of a place where they can be more dynamic with our housing market.
Let them have capital, let them recapitalize, and back to that notion again of serving two masters. I actually think it's incredibly effective to serve two masters because you're trying to make the world a better place by expanding mortgage credit, but you've also got a bottom line that you have to be wary of, which keeps these impulses in check. People say, why don't we just leave Fannie and Freddie? I know I'm going to come back to your question. People say, why don't we just leave Fannie and Freddie the way they are, effectively nationalized? To me, you have to be pretty far along the spectrum on policy-wise to argue that you want the government to have its thumb on the finger of mortgage credit through these two companies. I mean, I think that's really frightening without any regard for what their profits are. I happen to like the idea of them serving two masters and having to care about their profits while also having to care about this social good. I think it's a balance that's good, not necessarily bad. So I'd give them capital. I'd set the rules of the road so that they could raise capital in the market, and I'd try to give them as effective a regulator as you could, and rules, hopefully rules that encourage counter-cyclical behavior, such that when the market is going completely crazy, they have an incentive to step back instead of to dive in and try to keep their market share as they did in the run-up to the financial crisis. But I'm not. Somebody may have a solution that's better than that. I just haven't heard it yet.
And what about?
Because I'm not saying it's perfect.
No, I understand. Yes, we're choosing from imperfect options.
Right.
And so, what about for the individual homeowner or prospective homeowner, as they're trying to manage their financial future? What does this all mean to them in terms of concrete steps or considerations they should make, thinking about this biggest purchase they're ever going to make?
Get a mortgage now, while rates are low and Fannie and Freddie are still around.
Right.
No, I don't. It feels a little bit amorphous to the average homeowner, but basically, without Fannie and Freddie, without government involvement, there would not have been a mortgage market in this country since the financial crisis. They've taken some 80 to 90% of mortgages have actually gone through the government, whether it's Fannie or Freddie or the FHA.
Yeah, but are people that are looking at the value of their home right now in kind of the context of all the other variables like property taxes and so forth, particularly in Illinois. Yeah. But as they're looking at that, or they're assessing whether to buy a home, and you're telling them that Fannie and Freddie are in this kind of bad limbo state 7 years after the bubble, and there's paralysis in DC to do anything, and this is leading us to a bad path. Is that a suggestion? Let's just wait and see how this plays out if you're renting right now, because at least you minimize your damage if things go bad yet again so soon after the bubble 7 years ago.
Right. It's a really good question. I wish I had a great piece of advice. I would have told people, if I were advising people, I would have said, in fact, I did tell my poor mother-in-law after the financial crisis to sell her house and to get out now while she could, and I turned out to be so very wrong, because you look around at what's going around in Chicago now, and you feel like it's bubble redo, right? I mean,
the holidays must be tough for you these days, right?
I think she's forgiven me.
No, okay.
She couldn't handle the stairs anyway. It's okay.
Right,
but anyway, so I'm cautious with any kind of advice to people, because I've been around long enough to know how often I've been wrong, because I see danger everywhere, and so I see a lot of danger in the housing market right now. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be right.
And a lot of danger, all that danger.
But I know
documented,
I'm right about this.
Documented. And
it may not end badly anytime soon, but it's not good.
And that is all documented in Shaky Ground, the new book by Bethany McLean. Also, you should check out Smartest Guys in the Room, the book that she wrote with a co-author about the Enron accounting scandal and the implosion of Enron. Bethany McLean has been our guest on this edition of Against the Current. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you for having me.